Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 92 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at Lund University. Connect with the show on Twitter by following us at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all, thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be looking at some academic research evaluating how social media use affects protest participation and political participation more broadly. But we're going to do that with a twist and look at how social media platforms affect protest participation differently depending on how the platform is coded and designed, their architectures, and how users interact with them, which are often called affordances. So the idea is that even though people might use social media platforms to get involved or to organize protests, the mechanisms through which that protest participation happens might differ depending on the design of the platform. And that's exactly what seems to be happening, at least in the context of protests. So to tell us more about it is Dr. Sebastian Valenzuela. He is an associate professor of communication at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and he's done some research testing exactly this. How do different social media platforms influence how Chilean youth get involved with protests? And as we'll talk about in the episode, it's an interesting case because Chile has a very sort of vibrant activism culture, especially since 2011, when there were a lot of student protests. And so I think this episode is timely because it connects in a way to the protests going on in Hong Kong, where students are heavily involved and also have this history of protesting in Hong Kong with the umbrella protests of 2014. So obviously, the cases are different in many ways. The social media use is different in many ways, but it's important to conceptualize that not all social media platforms are the same. And this affects how people use the platforms generally, but in terms of politics and political activism, how they discuss politics, how news is shared, what type of news is shared, and how protests are organized. So we're going to focus specifically on protest participation across Facebook and Twitter by digging into a paper called Ties, Likes, and Tweets, using strong and weak ties to explain differences in protest participation across Facebook and Twitter use. It's published in the Journal of Political Communication, and the authors are Dr. Valenzuela, Teresa Correa, and Homero Gil de Zuniga, who has been a previous guest on the show. So we're going to dive into that study, and then if that wasn't enough, we're going to do a double whammy on some more recent research from 2019, also in political communication, called A Meta-Analysis of the Effects of Cross-Cutting Exposure on Political Participation. So in this case, we're not looking at protests specifically, but political participation broadly, and what other studies have said about what happens when you're exposed to information that you disagree with online. So this study is pretty fresh off the press. I'm not going to go into here what a meta-analysis is. If you're not familiar with that, you can dial back to episode 26 with the queen of meta-analysis in political communication, Dr. Shelley Boulian, where we dive into that. So we're kind of just going to jump ahead, dive right into it. And I think this is a great episode, not just for the conceptual thinking and the empirical findings that come out of it, but also Dr. Valenzuela is very generous, I would say, in sort of opening up the hood and talking about how he conceptualizes his research designs. So apart from the conceptual thinking and the empirical approach, I think what comes through in this interview is a lot of best practices in terms of how you should formulate your research design and also how to sort of carry it through. So we kind of break down the decision-making process behind that as we go along. So super interesting, great for all the students out there. And there's also a lot of tips about what we need to do more research on and where postgraduate students, doctoral students can really contribute in innovation there. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Sebastian Valenzuela. Again, he is an associate professor of communication at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. Dr. Valenzuela, thanks so much for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So much of your research explores how information affects citizens' participation in politics. And I'd like to dive into a couple of your studies looking at that question from a couple different angles. And the first examines how Facebook and Twitter influence protest participation. But before we get into the findings, it's important to understand, I think, the difference between strong and weak social ties. So can you explain what strong and weak ties are and how they might each affect citizens' participation?
Yeah, so the idea of strong and weak ties, I think it goes all the way back to Mark Granovetter's seminal work back in the early 70s. And basically, the idea is that everyone is embedded in a social network, right? So, social networks are structures, basically, where individuals participate and we engage, right? And Granovetter, what he was describing was the idea that within these social network structures, you could distinguish like two different types of actors or two different types of networks actually,
Hmm.
and he called them strong and weak ties for a reason. And the difference is that we might be connected to different people, and with these different individuals that we regularly interact, we have a different level of intimacy or reciprocity with them, right? So for example, one's family or one's close friends, we have a different, of course, type of communication and interaction than with coworkers or neighbors or acquaintances. And his idea was that to understand social networks, you need to make a distinction between these different types of people that you're connected to. And he said that with those that you feel closer to emotionally, the people with whom you rely on to hang out or actually accomplish something as such as, when you need someone to borrow money from, you would tend to rely on strong ties. But weak ties are important too because it's people that bring something new to your own social circle. So, for example, a coworker or someone who's new in your school and that you start developing a relationship, you're going to relate to that person differently. And he said that those kind of links are important, and they're called weak ties because you don't have the level of intimacy that you do have with your strong ties.
Right. And I can understand how strong ties might affect, someone's ability to participate in politics or having political discussions because that's someone that we really kind of know and trust. But
Mhm.
where do weak ties kind of fit into the picture?
So going back again to Granovetter, he said that weak ties are really important to learn new information. So strong ties, basically, you can observe them by seeing who do you interact most frequently with, and you tend to, focus on your friends and your family. The problem is that because you interact so much with your strong ties, you kind of know what they know. So you don't get like a lot of new information from them because it's kind of redundant. You already know what's going on. Weak ties, the most important benefit from a social network structure perspective is that because you don't have such an ongoing relationship with them, when you interact with them, chances are they're going to bring some novelty to your, information structure, meaning you're going to bring news. You're going to learn something new that you didn't know because you don't know them that well. So whatever they're bringing to the conversation and communication is going to be something new. And to the degree that information is an important antecedent of participation, chances are that weak ties are going to bring that new information that might be, very important for you to learn about something you didn't know, and that's going to maybe motivate you to participate. So, for example, maybe you are interested in the environment and you want to participate in an environmental cause. The problem is that what happens if your friends are not into that or your family? I mean, nothing's going to come out from the communications you have with them that is going to allow you to know when's the next protest or when's the next cause or something that the environmental group is saying. Contrary to that, if you are, at work, you might know different people, and chances are that those people are more heterogeneous, and some of them might be interested in environmental causes too. And eventually, with the water cooler effect, right? What are you doing? I don't know. I'm going to go there. And have you heard about this new movement or this protest or whatever? No, I didn't know that, right? And now you know, and then just are okay. Now there's this thing, and maybe I'm motivated to participate, and boom, you participate. I'm kind of making a very kind of a caricature of the way it is, but I would say that novel information is the big thing that weak ties bring into your world that might enable you to participate more.
Right. And then in the study, you argue that Facebook and Twitter support interactions between different types of ties. So, what aspects of the two platforms lead you to expect that difference?
So we kind of use in the study the idea of affordances, which is this idea that technology and platforms such as Facebook or Twitter have these potentialities, right? So you might describe these technologies by their features, but it also, these features are important only to the degree that actually people use them. So for example, what we argue is that you can connect with both strong ties and weak ties through any platform, right? Through Twitter, through Facebook, or any other platform. But what it happens is that usually people use Facebook to interact or to extend those strong tie communications. So you might have a lot of people on your Facebook network, but if you start measuring who do you interact more often to, who do you write, messages, or whose friends are you seeing on your Facebook wall, they tend to be, those who you have a longer, deeper, or intimate communication. That doesn't happen so often on Twitter. On Twitter, you can follow your family and your friends, of course, right? But most people use Twitter to actually communicate with your weak ties. So this is people that you share an interest, not necessarily a personal bond, right? So I'm into sports, so I follow, journalists who are in, sports journalism, or I'm interested in, in this political cause. Well, I follow those who are in that party or movement or whatever. And that doesn't mean I have with them a deep communication, social link, as in strong ties. I just follow them because it's kind of an interest-based network. So we argue that Twitter, although you can communicate with strong ties and weak ties, most people use them to communicate with what we would call weak ties. And Facebook, on the other hand, again, you can communicate with your strong ties and weak ties, but it just happens that most people use Facebook to communicate, with your stronger ties.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I really like about the study is focusing on that platform difference rather than social media communication as one type of genre. And so what were you actually looking to test in this study, and kind of what were your expectations around it?
Right. So actually, your point is totally right. I mean, that was the inspiration for the study, was kind of to make the point that we've been studying and speaking of social media all the time. But see, social media, it's a very multidimensional concept. It's like Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp and YouTube, all of them are social media, but they're so different, right? So we kind of thought, how can we make this argument that not all social media are the same or they work the same? And yet, how do we connect that with the theory of social movements and social networks? And we found that, just by thinking about, like, how do we use it, Twitter? Well, Twitter is for news, right? Most people say that. Well, news means information. And to the degree that novel information, we know that that comes most likely from weak ties. Is there something to weak ties and Twitter? And then we thought, okay, and what do we do on Facebook? Yeah, news is out there, right? We follow news on Facebook, but do we mostly use Facebook for news? No, we mostly use Facebook to socialize and to kind of catch up with what our friends are doing, and to catch up with, our extended family. Well, the literature says that those people are what you would call strong ties. And that's how the paper in the study, was the starting point. It's like there's this difference between these platforms, and maybe it's because of the type of people you connect to, strong ties and weak ties, and that's how we took it forward. And then it was basically kind of developing the argument. So we knew from previous research that weak ties and strong ties both matter for participation. So it kind of was logical to, okay, if different ties matter differently for participation, and we are thinking that maybe different social platforms are related to different types of network structures, then if you make the whole picture, it's kind of what the study is about. It's like the idea of platforms, networks, participation.
Right. And as we'll get to, there is an interesting difference there, but to hold off a little bit for the suspense, you focus particularly on looking at these ties and the interactions across platforms in the context of protest. So I wanted to ask you why you focused on protest specifically and not some other form of participation.
Yes. So this is a question that I've been, getting at some point. Why do you focus on protests, and why don't we focus on other types of participation? And I think there are, I would say, two main reasons. One is that most of the studies that have linked social media use to political participation at the individual level, they tend to find that the relationship is stronger for protest behavior rather than to electoral forms of participation. So, for example, the work by Shelley Bullian, she finds that, doing meta-analysis of social media use and participation, she finds that this relationship is kind of stronger for non-conventional forms of participation. So it's kind of a best case scenario to test. If you're finding something with protest participation and social media, if you want to find a relationship, chances are you're going to find it when you are measuring protest participation rather than, for example, voting, right? So that was one reason. It's like these ideas haven't been tested before. And if we're going to invest our time and effort in doing something, let's, start with the best case scenario. So in that case, I mean, it's kind of a strategic or practical perspective. But the second argument is that you also have to think about the context. So this study was conducted in Chile, and we were thinking, okay, in Chile, of course, you have elections and people vote, but we also have a wave of participation that started in 2010, kind of also at the same time where, in the States, you had Occupy Wall Street, and in Spain, you had the Indignados movement. And Chile was also part of that, especially with the student movement. So we were thinking, okay, if we're doing our study in Chile, what kind of participation has been more prevalent lately? And it's not voting. I mean, turnout, it has been decreasing in every election. What has been picking up instead is protest participation, people going to the streets or signing petitions and movements. And we thought, okay, this is interesting. So the context is kind of demanding that you study this type of participation rather than another one. So that would say that was the second reason.
Right, because I was reading a little bit about Chile, and yeah, they had these sort of very popular student movements, and the group that you actually tested these ideas on was a representative sample of young adults living in urban areas specifically, so kind of hitting that student population. So
exactly.
Is that again a way to kind of look at kind of the best case scenario where we would expect to find something?
Exactly. So this is something that, when you're doing research in a kind of a new area, there are different, ways of approaching that challenge, right? And one is like, let's look at a population where you think that the relationship you're trying to examine is most likely to exist. And that's kind of the approach we took here in this study. Another approach would be, let's go to study the population where this relationship is barely there, just to see, kind of test the limits of kind of the theoretical currency of what you're doing. And it all depends on the state of of the field. I would say that if we had to repeat this study again in 2020, for example, I'm not so sure I would go for urban youth. Maybe I would go for the larger adult population, just because now the use of social media is much more prevalent. And now that we know that social media and protest participation, that link exists, we need to start focusing on other forms of participation that are also important for democracy, such as, again, voting or new forms of participation. So I think it's also, kind of an approach is like, let's see, if you don't have a lot of work already out there, let's go and see where you're most likely to find a relationship. And once you find it, then you start accumulating knowledge, and then you go to the other route, which is like, okay, let's see where this relationship doesn't exist, just to see the limits. But in our case, when we did our study, it was the other way around. There's not a lot of out there, and we don't have tons of resources. So if you have limited resources, go where you're most likely to find something, and you take it from there.
Totally. Great advice for the scholars listening. And we have quite a few postgraduate students listening who might be working on developing their survey questions as the semester kicks off. So what type of questions did you actually ask this sample in order to get at the type of ideas you were trying to test?
Yeah, so one of the nice things about doing survey research in Chile and in countries where it's not so expensive to do face-to-face surveys is that you're able to actually have these, to conduct these representative samples in a cheaper environment than if you are, doing these studies in the US or elsewhere. That doesn't mean that you cannot do them, but considering we had the chance of doing a face-to-face survey, you can ask a longer survey. You can have more questions in there, because once you get someone to answer the door and, to listen to you, it's like it's your chance to kind of, develop a longer survey. So we measure tons of things. I mean, we were lucky enough. It was like 80 questions or something like that. Yeah. So when we've done afterwards, like online surveys, you cannot do that. I mean, we just log off. But anyway, so for this study, we measure a number of items to, of course, get to protest participation. So street demonstrations and online, signing petitions and stuff like that. We weren't kind of very original in terms of coming up with new items because, again, we wanted to be kind of conservative and said, okay, what's the kind of the standard way of measuring participation? And, so we build upon existing measures. Then with social media, it was kind of easy in terms of measuring the use of Facebook and Twitter generally, right? The challenging part was to measure these strong tie, weak tie network structures. So we came up with, I would say, an original kind of questions, and we put a lot of work thinking how to measure this thing. And we ended up with the items that we used in the study, which is basically trying to get people to answer the frequency with whom you kind of receive information about. We didn't want to say political stuff because then people think you're talking about elections. So we said information about issues of public interest, such as, and we put examples just to get at the idea that us as researchers, are we understanding the same as what survey participants are understanding when we say participation? So we wanted to kind of put some examples there just to make people to be more accurate in their responses. And we included examples such as invitations to join a street demonstration or sign a petition. On your account, from people you know personally and feel close to, which is kind of the definition of strong tie, or from people that you don't know really personally, and you don't feel very connected, which would be the definition of weak ties. And we did that separately for Facebook and Twitter. And with that, we kind of had all the basic variables. The dependent variable, which would be protest participation, and then the independent variable, which would be uses of Facebook and Twitter generally. And then we had the mediating variables, which is the strong ties and weak ties measures separated for Facebook and Twitter.
Right. And that's where things start to get interesting. So can you break down, you ran a bunch of statistics and ultimately what did you find?
So on the one hand, we found something that was kind of reassuring, meaning it was kind of expected, which is the relationship between general usages of Facebook and Twitter and connection with weak ties and strong ties. So more specifically, what we found was that using Facebook generally, like more frequently, of course, makes you more likely to communicate both with strong ties and weak ties, and the same with Twitter. So people who use social media more, just probabilistically, are more likely to communicate with family and friends and also with acquaintances and strangers, to put it kind of in lay terms. So that was nice. We found that and we kind of, okay, what we're measuring, it's not crazy. We kind of was reassuring. But the next set of findings was most interesting because what we found was that although you can use these platforms, Facebook and Twitter, to communicate with both strong ties and weak ties, that doesn't mean that strong tie or weak tie communication relate to participation similarly. What we found was that Facebook strong tie communication was predictive of participation, protest participation, but not weak tie Facebook participation. And conversely, on Twitter, it was the other way around. So strong tie Twitter use was not related to protest participation, but weak tie Twitter use was. And again, going back to the original theoretical expectation, this, we think, kind of falls into this story that Twitter is very good at making you communicate or learn something from your weak ties. And to the degree that it does that, then weak tie Twitter communication will lead to participation. On the other hand, Facebook is very good at extracting resources from your strong ties. And those resources that you obtain from your strong ties that you're connecting to through Facebook is what really matters for participation. So we're finding is like both strong ties and weak ties matter, but they matter differently. And Facebook and Twitter matter for participation, but they matter differently, which is kind of a neat story, going back to the idea that, Facebook, Twitter, social media is related to participation. We know that, but they matter differently. And it's kind of these mechanisms things that we find that to us was kind of the interesting main result of the study.
Yeah. Also interesting that it kind of relates to these, offline social network theories from, as you mentioned, going back to the 70s. And I wonder if, I know you haven't necessarily tested this directly, but do you think that these tie strengths mediated by the two platforms also have implications for other types of participation?
That's a good question, because in the end, the only thing we measured and we found a relationship was with protest participation. But I would say that on the one hand, It all depends on kind of how you conceive participation. So what's the thing with protest participation? It's kind of a costly activity. It's not that easy, right? I mean, joining a street demonstration or finding out about a protest movement is not so easy compared to, for example, voting. In an election, in democratic countries at least, you are flooded with information. The question is, do you need social media to learn where to vote or for whom to vote? I'm not so sure. So on the one hand, I would think that if we replicated this study with traditional forms of participation, my expectation, just like in my hunch, would be that these relationships would be weaker. And they would be weaker not because social media it's not important per se, but they would be weaker because I would think that, for example, traditional media would be sufficient to kind of learn the needed information that's required for you to go to the voting booth and vote, right? So I'm not so sure if social media would provide unique informational or social resources needed to participate. So I would say I'm not so sure. Now, on the other hand, to the degree that electoral participation is becoming more and more over time an internet thing, a social media affair. I mean, it's like to the degree that people don't go to the news, to the mainstream media so much as they go to, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, and they learn incidentally about politics through using those platforms. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe actually, you would find the same relationships that we found for protest participation when you are measuring electoral participation. So that would be an interesting question. And, if students are listening to this podcast, I would say one thing that I would be really thrilled to learn about would be, why don't you take this study and you replicate it in your own setting? And rather than testing protest participation, go for other measures of participation and see what's out there. I mean, again, I don't think we are at a stage of knowledge right now where we could say, oh, yeah, this is what you should find. I'm not so sure. And that makes it so interesting to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And also, as you mentioned, in different contexts as well, where the Chilean context seems to be kind of primed towards activism, especially Latin America more broadly.
Yeah, definitely.
So if that wasn't enough, I know maybe some of the listeners are kind of finished their morning commute, but might want to take the second part of the episode towards their home commute, which is looking at, you've done a study, a meta-analysis, which we've covered before in the show with some colleagues from Vienna, Denmark, and Germany.
Yes.
And that meta-analysis looked at the effects of cross-cutting exposure on political participation, broadly defined. So not just protests, but lots of different forms.
Yeah.
And to start out here, what is cross-cutting exposure, and how might today's media environment make studying the effects of cross-cutting exposure particularly important?
So cross-cutting exposure is a concept that was developed many decades ago. I would say that the work of Lazarsfeld back in the 40s was already using this concept of cross pressures or cross-cutting exposure. And the concept is very simple. It's basically the level of disagreement in perspectives and points of view that you might encounter in your communication environments, broadly defined. So for many years, cross-cutting exposure was defined as disagreement that you encounter within your face-to-face or interpersonal social networks. And now it has become also a concept to encompass also mediated forms of communication. You could say that you could have interpersonal cross-cutting exposure, but you could also talk about mediated or media cross-cutting exposure. But the idea is the same. It's like how diverse and how much disagreement it's out there that you're encountering in your communication environments.
Yeah, I think exploring this question is super important these days because, there's been a lot of talk about filter chambers and echo bubbles or can't talk. It doesn't seem to be the case, and therefore cross-cutting exposure becomes particularly relevant. And there's arguments for both why being exposed to this cross-cutting exposure would be positive or negative for your participation. So could you break down the kind of arguments for why being exposed to cross-cutting information might increase participation and then why it might depress it?
Yes. So in the early 90s, Diana Matz basically was responsible for putting the concept back as a central concept to studying political communication. And we owe a lot to her because basically she opened a new venue for research. Now, interestingly enough, that research has taken many different routes. And now we're living in an era where what you're saying is totally right, which is that there, a school of thought that argues that cross-cutting exposure is bad for participation, and another school of thought that basically it's good or not as bad as Diana Matz found originally. So what are the arguments for one side and the other side? So Matz argued that and found that there are two reasons why cross-cutting exposure might have this unfortunate consequence, which is the idea that people are going to participate less the more they are exposed to cross-cutting information. And she said that on the one hand, when you encounter disagreement in your social environments, one of the unintended consequences of that is that you become less certain about your own political ideas. You kind of develop ambivalence. So say, for example, you think that candidate A is very good and you're willing to vote for that person. But it happens that if your friends are all voting for candidate B, you kind of care about your friends and, you trust them and you start wondering, I'm voting for A, but they're voting for B. What should I do? And that uncertainty, that doubt kind of has this consequence that you don't know what to do. And to the degree that you don't know what to do, you are less likely to go there and say, I'm going to vote for something, because you are kind of trying to sort out this dissonance. So the second argument by Matz was the idea that because you want to maintain social harmony, meaning you don't want to get into a fight with your friends or with your family, if you think differently, those costs are going to be more evident to you. It's like, do I want to say that, my people's candidate is not my own candidate? I mean, do I want to get into that? So because you don't want to get into a fight or you don't want to have arguments, you might kind of refrain from voting or saying that you're going to vote for someone differently, or you're going to go out there to a rally. And then because there's going to be this kind of social accountability. Oh, so you vote for this guy, huh? So people want to refrain from that, and we are conflict avoidant in general, and so we don't vote. The thing is that other research subsequently found that not only cross-cutting exposure didn't have that negative effect that Matz found, but actually some research even found the other way around. Was like, actually, the more you are exposed to cross-cutting information, the more likely you are to participate. And some of the explanations that have been found there are like, we argue in the paper, you could summarize them into three different routes. One would be learning, right? So when you encounter different viewpoints, you learn more about something. And we know from tons of research that learning, political knowledge, is an antecedent of participation. So for example, if through a cross-cutting exposure, you're learning more about politics in general, then maybe you're more likely to participate. So that would be one mechanism. The other one is what we call information search. So for example, if you are discussing with people who think differently, politically speaking, that might pique your interest in learning more about the issue that you were discussing about. And information search, we also know it's, can lead to participation. So for example, you want to learn more about something because you need to discuss, there's going to be this dinner and you're a conservative and all your friends are liberals and the election is coming. So you want to be well prepared for that discussion. Then maybe one way of preparing is that you're going to turn the news and follow the news more that week just to know and, get ammunition for your discussion that's coming up. And the third one would be polarization or attitude strength. So the more you are exposed to different viewpoints, some people develop your attitudes become more crystallized. It's like, I'm a conservative, and because I have to argue with my liberal family, and I'm making up this example actually, I hold more steadfast to my own convictions. So I kind of develop a more strong attitude toward politics. And again, research has found that the more strongly you think about something, the more strongly held an attitude, the more likely you are to participate. So here you find tons of explanations that some of them lead you to a negative path. Cross-cutting exposure is negatively related to participation. And then you have other explanations to see the positive path. And the question is, okay, what's going on? Are these, which one has more empirical currency? And that's kind of the gist of the purpose of the study.
Right. And you do a great job summarizing all those different, of course, as a meta-analysis, it's a sort of recap of what literature is out there. And so you ask a total of 8 research questions, which is a massive amount. But I want to focus, definitely. But I want to focus only on the 2 that deal specifically with the online aspects of cross-cutting exposure. And one of those research questions asks whether cross-cutting exposure's effects on participation differ based on online versus offline cross pressures. So can you describe what those cross pressures are and why there's a reason to expect difference between the online and offline cross pressures?
Yeah, so cross pressures, it's kind of we're using it as a synonym of cross-cutting exposure. But the idea here is that the setting in which this cross-cutting exposure takes place might matter. It's one thing to argue face to face with someone who thinks differently, and it's another if you are on Twitter and you are replying to an opinion that you don't agree with. I mean, it's just differently. The level of motivation, the social costs, for example, that might be involved are going to be different. I mean, think about incivility. So we know that that's a huge problem on the internet, right? So incivility, everyone's studying it because it has lots of consequences. You become more polarized and so forth. The question is, I mean, do you think that the level of incivility we see on social media is equivalent to the level of incivility we encounter on a daily face-to-face basis? No, right? Because people are willing to say something to a keyboard that they're not going to say it face-to-face to someone. So using that kind of logic, we kind of thought the same. Maybe the difference between positive and negative effects on cross-cutting exposure and participation, maybe the difference is because some studies are testing or measuring cross-cutting exposures like Diana Matz did in terms of face-to-face interpersonal communication. And more recent research has been studying online forms of cross-cutting exposure, and we think that might make a difference. Anonymity is also in there. We didn't actually put that in the paper. We didn't have the space, but one of the idea was like the length of the exposure to cross-cutting information. So, for example, on a face-to-face, chances are the communication is going to take longer. You're going to be discussing. It's like you don't talk about politics and one sentence goes here and one sentence goes there, and that's it. But that's kind of the way cross-cutting exposure online takes place, particularly in social media. I mean, if you see a tweet that is contrary to your own ideas and you reply to that tweet, and that's it. Well, that's a very common kind of cross-cutting exercise that you can do on social media that doesn't really take place offline. So maybe that's a difference. Maybe online you are arguing with everyone, but you don't care because you're not personally invested that much psychologically into that cross-cutting, exchange. Face-to-face, it's like totally different. You are so invested because you have someone there. You need to save face and you want to maintain a polite relationship and whatever. So all that is behind this expectation of finding difference between online and offline.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point about how that discourse is actually different between face-to-face and computer mediated. And I guess it also applies to the next research question, which is about cross-cutting exposure's effect on online versus offline participation. Uh-huh. I know you just kind of formulated the research question in the paper, but did you have any expectations that cross-cutting exposure would affect online versus offline participation more?
We kind of, maybe I should speak for myself because I don't know what George and David and Christian would think about this, but we kind of wrestle with that. And my perspective was that I would think that offline forms of participation would be more influenced by cross-cutting exposure than online forms. And the reason I would expect that is because offline participation is more costly. It demands more resources. I mean, you need to physically do something. You need to plan ahead. I mean, it takes more time. It's more costly. If you want to vote, you need to know where to vote. You actually have to move your body and go there and vote. If you're thinking about a protest, you need to go there and you'd suffer the consequence of maybe, if it becomes a riot or a police. So it's just more costly. And because it's more costly, there's more than you need to defend, socially speaking, if you're going to engage in that kind of behavior. It's like, if I'm going to go to a rally, my close circles are going to ask me about it, right? I mean, they will know, or maybe I will be, seen there. And I would just have to give more explanations. And I would think, in that sense, Diana Matz's argument makes a lot of sense, this idea of social accountability. But see, online, if you're signing a petition or you are joining, a Facebook group that demands it's a social movement or whatever, chances are, who's going to know? Or if they know, you might as well do that with anonymity, right? So it's like the costs are just not there, or they're not so, evident. So that was my hunch, but I would say I'm not so sure if my co-authors would agree. But I would think that offline forms would be more affected by cross-cutting exposure than online forms.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to probe you a bit beyond what was in the paper. So
Yeah.
you then analyzed the findings of 48 previously published studies, the sort of meta-analysis tradition that give you enough data to test these research questions statistically. And I think the findings are quite interesting. So at the end of the day, what are the overall effects of cross-cutting exposure on participation?
Yeah, we were surprised too. So the overall effects is like no effects, no, nada, right? Basically, what we found was that if you average the effects of these 48 studies, and I don't know how many thousand participants we are pulling together,
70,000 or something.
70,000, right? Yeah. So what we found was that the average effect of cross-cutting communication and participation was zero, not statistically significant, neither positive nor negative. It was like not there. Now, when you find through a meta-analysis that the overall effect is null, I mean, not differently from zero, of course, the next step is like, okay, this means that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the research, right? And so is there a systematic explanation for why some studies are finding a positive effect and other studies are finding a negative effect? And in our meta-analysis, we probed like 8 different sets of explanations, you could say, that we were thinking might explain systematically why we find this null effect. But again, we found also null effects for this secondary analysis, meaning none of the explanations that we thought would explain this heterogeneity were consistent enough to find a significant relationship. So bottom line, cross-cutting exposure per se doesn't have a noticeable effect on participation, not positive nor negative, it's not there. And if that's a result of cross-cutting exposure not mattering, or is it because some sets of studies are finding a positive effect and others are finding a negative effect? We don't find, again, a consistent explanation with all the different suspects we had. It's not because offline studies find a negative effect and online studies find a positive effect. No, it's not there. It's not because we're measuring, maybe some studies find interpersonal cross-cutting exposure to have one kind of effect and maybe mediated cross-cutting exposure having another kind of effect. No, it's not that. It's not because we are measuring studies that use, conducted in Europe or North America or differently from those conducted elsewhere. So it's not that. Again, we could go on and on, but we try to find an explanation for why we find this overall null effect. And with all the analysis we did, we were not able to find a consistent explanation. So what we found is like a non-effect. And that's kind of interesting too. It's like, okay, none of the explanations that we thought might explain this null effect explain it. So what's the main takeout? Well, to me, on the one hand, this alleviates the concern of the negative effects of cross-cutting exposure. I mean, regardless of the explanation, if you find that overall the effect is so tiny that it's not statistically significant, I guess it's like, okay, maybe we shouldn't care that much about cross-cutting exposure as detrimental or, again, as super positive for participation. Maybe it's not there. Maybe cross-cutting exposure matters for something else, tolerance or polarization, but not necessarily participation. And I guess that, to me, would be kind of the big takeaway. And the second one would be that maybe all these studies are incomplete, meaning they are trying to test a direct connection between cross-cutting exposure and participation. And maybe the way to go is to start focusing on these indirect effects, like the ones we tested in the first study we were talking in the program. And that would be kind of the main homework that we need to do as researchers. Like, if regardless of an overall effect of this positive or negative, like start thinking, what mechanisms would make you to predict that you would find a positive effect or a negative effect? And that's kind of a work to be done that we haven't really engaged into.
Exactly. And I want to ask you just about that, because I know when you're doing a meta-analysis, you're limited to what other studies have tested. And one of the mediators that the meta-analysis couldn't test because of that was exactly what we were talking about before, which is whether cross-cutting exposure might have different effects based on whether it comes from strong or weak ties. I think you were able to test whether it came from media or acquaintances, but not quite close versus or strong versus weak ties. So kind of linking these two studies together, do you think that cross-cutting exposure on Facebook and Twitter would have different effects on participation based on the different type of ties that these platforms encourage?
That's an excellent point, because honestly, I hadn't thought really about that. I mean, of course, now that I look back, it's like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Strong ties and weak ties should matter for this research, for this line of research. It's like my expectation would be that because you care more about your strong ties, encountering cross-cutting exposure in your strong ties, I'm sure would be more consequential for an individual than encountering cross-cutting information through your weak ties. So maybe ties might make a difference. On the other hand, you could argue that even if you're choosing your strong ties because they think similarly to you, and that's kind of one of the concerns that people have in this line of research, right? The idea that we are living in these echo chambers and filter bubbles. That I don't personally agree with that idea. But anyway, the idea is that we are starting to select our social ties using the idea of the shortcut of, do they agree with me or not? If we're doing that, then weak ties might also matter for cross-cutting exposure, because it's only there with weak ties with whom you'll be able to find the diverse perspective. So again, maybe that's one possible route to study in the future, which is the idea of strong ties and weak ties, and how the type of information, is it like-minded or is it disagreeing, matter for participation. That's a very good question. But again, not a lot of studies incorporate this, because the idea of strong ties and weak ties comes from social network theory and from the sociological perspective on communication, whereas a lot of the work on cross-cutting exposure takes more the psychological or social psychological perspective. So you find kind of these two literatures that kind of talk about the same stuff, but they are just looking differently. And this is also common, in political communication, where we borrow theories from psychology or sociology, and we're all, thinking that we are doing research on the same issue, and yet we don't have these literatures conversing with each other. And I think that's kind of, again, a challenge for us researchers to tackle upon. I really think that when you find these puzzling results, such as ours in this meta-analysis, what it means is that we need to think outside the box. And if none of the usual suspects are good explanations, we need to come up with new suspects. And I think that's a neat thing. I would say that was not the first reaction we got when we first ran the statistical analysis, that we found like these null effects. We thought like, no, this is wrong. I mean, what do you mean null effects? But then, and I said, okay, one of these moderators, one of these explanations are gonna, it's gonna find the key to this puzzle. And then again, we didn't. But then that's the challenging part, and that's the fun part. It's like, okay, let's think outside the box, and what else? And you posit a very good likely candidate. And if more studies incorporate these social network concepts, such as strong ties and weak ties, in their surveys, for example, that would help us do that homework. But I don't know, it's a challenge.
Definitely. Well, hopefully either you or someone out there listening will do that, and then we can have a part 2 of this podcast.
Exactly.
But I think there's enough knowledge packed into this one. So Dr. Valenzuela, thanks so much for taking the time out and coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It was a pleasure.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Sebastian Valenzuela, Associate Professor of Communication at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll be speaking with Dr. Dan Lane, Assistant Professor of Communication at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where we're going to be looking at how political self-expression online contributes to our political identities. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.